Hi, everybody. Welcome to 10 Billion Mouths to Feed, Emissions, Urban Agriculture, and Development. The learning objectives for this session are shown on the next slide, right here. And we'll be following up with a survey and with more information on how to receive credit from AIA. We'll collect questions submitted to the Q&A box throughout the session, and if the speakers aren't able to get to your questions, we'll have them answer in writing and share the answers on the website after the teach-in. Now it's my pleasure to introduce the speakers for this session, Michael Grove and Henry Gordon-Smith. Michael Grove is the Chair of Landscape Architecture, Civil Engineering, and Ecology at Sasaki and sits on Sasaki's Board of Directors. Leading much of the firm's work in Asia, he's a fierce advocate for the vital role that landscape architects play in shaping contemporary cities. Informed by a rigorous inquiry of economic, ecological, and cultural influences, he believes that the role of the designer is to make cities livable, equitable, resilient, and just. Today, in conversation with Henry Gordon-Smith, a sustainability strategist who speaks, writes, and consults globally on urban agriculture, water issues, and emerging technologies as the CEO and Managing Director of Agritecture Consulting, which he founded in 2014 in response to a global need for technology-agnostic guidance on urban agriculture. He'll talk about the potential of urban agriculture to embody these values while feeding the world's growing population in the context of rapid urbanization. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Natasha. What my bio doesn't mention is that although I'm trained as a landscape architect, I was probably a chef in another life. I love food. I love to look at it. I love to eat it. And I really love to talk about it. Food is at the core of who we are and how we interact with each other. And it plays a hugely important role in how we make decisions about the land. But as our cities continue to grow, the question of how we source our food is one that rarely comes to mind. In fact, before the pandemic, when this conference would have likely been held in a giant windowless convention center, we'd take it for granted that there would have been food outside the auditorium waiting for us, having magically come from somewhere. Let me put things in perspective as it relates to cities. I live in Boston, which has about 4.6 million people in the metro area, which means that assuming most people are eating breakfast, lunch, and dinner, Bostonians are consuming about 14 million meals per day. And although we in Boston like to think we're the hub of the universe, we're actually only the 89th largest city in the world. We've barely cracked the top 100. Imagine being in Shanghai, Delhi, or Tokyo with population upward of 20 and even 30 million. That means anywhere from 69 to 114 million meals are being consumed every day. All of that food needs to be planted, grown, harvested, processed, packaged, prepared, purchased, transported, eaten, disposed of. That's quite a life cycle. And I'm willing to bet that most people here are typically only involved in about 3 of those activities. For most humans, this has become our natural environment. What we often don't realize is that we are just as dependent on the natural world as our ancient ancestors were. So how did we get here? Well, it really started about 10,000 years ago here in the Fertile Crescent, where 2 inventions, agriculture and urbanism, happened in roughly the same place at the same time. From that point forward, agriculture and cities were bound together. We see that play out in both ancient and contemporary urban form. Here in the city of Ur in about 2000 BC, density is focused at the core with farmland beyond. This isn't that different from how we live today, with the exception being that everything is much larger and more spread out. Even by the 1st century AD, Rome had about 1 million people to feed, which meant that it had to begin importing food from far away. This need to feed growing cities was in fact the very beginning of imperialism. The physical form of our cities was also influenced by food. These are just a few interesting street names in London, all of which provide clues to the activities in the city at that time. Cornhill, Bread Street, my personal favorite, Haunch of Venison Yard. You probably have something similar in your city. Here in Boston, we have Quincy Market. In Seattle, there's Pike Place Market. In London, Borough Market. And in San Francisco and countless other cities around the globe, Market Street. A few years ago, my firm, Sasaki, did a survey to better understand how people feel about their city. One question was about what gets people excited about where they live. We thought they would say something like our amazing parks or the incredible architecture, but no, the winner was food. 46% of respondents said that they'd make a trek to try out a new restaurant beyond their neighborhood. We are a species that follows our stomachs. Beyond our cities, something that many believe has made America great is our agrarian history. But our romanticized version of the American farm couldn't be further from today's reality. Take contemporary Iowa, for example. Thought of by many as America's breadbasket, Iowans surprisingly have very little access to local food. Although they rank third in agricultural production, most of the food Iowans eat comes from an average of 1,200 miles away. All of those farms aren't growing the fresh food that Iowans need. It's growing commodity crops like corn and soybeans to feed livestock or to go into processed food. Less than 1% of Iowa's farms and even less of its land are growing food that goes directly to humans. California is another example of our precarious situation when it comes to food security. As the 5th largest agricultural producer in the world, California grows almost half of the fruits, nuts, and vegetables grown in the United States. That food needs water to grow. In California, 80% of the water consumed in the state goes to agriculture. In fact, one singular crop, alfalfa hay, again, which goes directly to feed livestock, not humans, requires more water than every household in California consumes on an annual basis. But what do we know about California? Well, first we know that it's really far away from population centers on the East Coast, which means higher transportation costs for our kale. And we also know that it's still recovering from the worst drought in 1,200 years. And when we look at the correlation between the counties most impacted by drought and the percentage of the country's fruits and vegetables that are grown there, the nation's food supply has reached an unacceptable level of risk. And it's not just California. Florida is in an equally precarious situation, accounting for nearly 1/3 of our fruits and vegetables in the United States. Whether drought in California, epic flooding in the plains, or higher intensity storms and sea level rise in Florida, climate change has an immeasurable impact on our food supply, especially to crops which are already highly vulnerable to shifts in weather patterns. This isn't just an American problem, though we certainly aren't leading by example. Around the world, 19 million hectares, that's about 47 million acres of rainforest are lost every year to farming. This destruction doesn't just release carbon, it also reduces biodiversity and increases the threat of diseases like COVID-19. By infringing on these ecosystems, we reduce the natural barriers between humans and host species, creating ideal conditions for diseases to spread. These microbes are not naturally human pathogens. They become human pathogens because we offer them that opportunity. All of that is to say that food as we know it today is not sustainable. This is not the future we were promised. When I was a kid in the 1980s, Willy Wonka suggested that chewing a piece of gum would provide you the same nutrition as eating a 3-course meal. Pan Am was going to offer nutritional liquid lunches on your next transatlantic flight. All of our food would be engineered and available in pill form. And the Jetsons promised us a machine where our food would magically appear at the push of a button. Unfortunately, these visions of the future have led us down a path of convenient processed foods. Starting in the 1950s and continuing through to today, many of us drive to big boxes at the edges of our cities to buy packaged food that is produced by one of 5 multinational corporations that control 80% of the agriculture of the entire planet. Think about that for a minute. Just 5 companies control 80% of the food we eat. This needs to change. And it is. Soil-based rooftop farms like this one built by the Brooklyn Grange are starting to pop up in cities around the world. They produce hyper-local food while also reducing urban heat islands and helping buildings to become more energy efficient. It's even happening at some of our most beloved landmarks like Fenway Park in Boston, where Green City Growers manages a farm on the roof of the baseball stadium, producing food that directly goes into the salad you're eating while you're watching the game. Universities around the world are also experimenting with feeding their students. Thammasat University in Thailand just opened this rooftop farm designed by Land Process, which has the added benefit of capturing and storing stormwater. While some of these examples are seasonal, it doesn't have to be. In Maine, where it's winter for just about 9 months of the year, hydroponically grown tomatoes are sold throughout New England for nearly the same costs as those imported from California or Mexico. Lettuce too, such as in this greenhouse operated by Little Leaf Farms just outside of Boston. So by now, maybe you're feeling a bit more optimistic that there are solutions to our food problems, but unfortunately I have a little more doom and gloom to share first. It's no secret that the planet's population is growing exponentially and that most of those people live in urban areas. Growing cities mean growing appetites. To meet those needs, we need to increase food production globally by about 70%. And even though our climate is changing, the way we're farming isn't. With the exception of mechanization and the increasing loss of biodiversity as a result of large corporate farms, agriculture hasn't really changed in eons, even though there are so many more of us occupying the planet. It's clear to me that the future of farming is urban. Sometimes, though, we're not doing ourselves any favors by suggesting utopian ideas without the science backing them first, though there's a lot to be said about being provocative to get people excited. But it's not all science fiction, it's happening. Vertical urban farms, though still experimental, are becoming viable enterprises. But as with most new ideas, there are skeptics. Are cities really the most appropriate places for food production? Right now, the financials may still be questionable, but if we look at the long game, where transportation costs increase, climate change creates new variables, and advances in technology make indoor growing cheaper, I believe there's real promise. We're in an incredible age of disruption. Imagine when autonomous vehicles are no longer experimental. We probably won't need the amount of infrastructure that's currently dedicated to parking. Again, this change is already happening. In Singapore, fresh produce grown in vertical farms is available for nearly half the cost of organic greens imported from Japan. Now, much of my work is in Asia, and for good reason. Cities in Asia and Africa are already some of the largest in the world, and that trajectory just continues. In China, the problem of growing cities is especially acute, with people and agriculture competing for the same land. All of China's arable land lies in the eastern half of the country, which also corresponds to where about 93% of the population lives. This conflict has resulted in a sobering amount of agricultural land lost to development, about 123,000 square kilometers in the span of a decade. For those of you who need a visual aid, that's just about equivalent to the size of the state of Iowa. Of the farmland that remains, about 20% of it is contaminated. Again, for you visual folks, those polluted areas represent just about the half of the land mass of California. China's use of pesticides and fertilizers is rising faster than any other country on earth, and with dire consequences. But you're all here to learn about carbon, and it's probably already crossed your mind that growing our food locally is the best solution because of the carbon we can save in transportation alone. You're not wrong, but our food's carbon footprint from transportation averages only about 5%. 80% is a result of our land use choices, whether it's the lost embodied carbon from destroying remnant forest or a similar disruption to native habitats. That burger you ate, 660 gallons of water went into producing it. And cattle production is responsible for 80% of the planet's deforestation. Yet we're not changing our habits. In China, imports of beef have increased 19,000% over the past decade. Great, I've convinced you to try an Impossible Burger, and I commend you, but I'm sorry to burst your bubble. Soy production is second to beef in terms of environmental damage. It's like replacing first-degree murder with second-degree murder. Fantastic, you'll switch your primary protein to seafood instead. But shrimp farming is the largest driver of mangrove deforestation. Mangroves are one of the most carbon-rich ecosystems on the planet, and their destruction releases carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere that makes farmed shrimp more environmentally damaging than pork or poultry. Our current diets and production practices are degrading terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems, depleting water resources, and driving climate change. All right, you're finally ready for the good news. I believe that vertical farms are an opportunity to leapfrog to the next generation of how cities source their food. At the Sunchow Urban Farm in Shanghai, we're building a collection of vertical farms that will supply much of the city's leafy greens locally, year-round, and at an economically viable scale. The light at the end of the tunnel is that Chinese cities are perfect for vertical farming. For example, in Shanghai, the average diet consists of about 56% leafy greens, which are the ideal crop for hydroponic systems. These systems are projected to increase yields by about 40 to 100 times what a traditional soil-based farm could produce. Vertical farms also mean you don't have to worry about if your vegetables were grown in contaminated soils. That isn't to say that we don't have to address the problems of traditional farming, but perhaps we can more quickly transition those lands to a better use, like habitat restoration and reforestation. They're also living laboratories, allowing Shanghai's urban residents, many of whom have never even seen a working farm, learn about how food is grown. I believe that vertical agriculture, like at Sunchow, needs to quickly become a fixture in cities around the world. In spite of where we find ourselves today, I'm optimistic about the future of food, and I'm now going to pass this on to Henry to walk us through more detail on some exciting advances that I believe are changing this narrative.
Thank you so much, Michael. Always enjoy hearing your presentations. Hello, everyone. I'm Henry Gordon-Smith. So we're going to dive a little bit deeper into different types of urban farms and their potential impact. So first, a question. Here we have 3 different kinds of urban farms. We have a rooftop greenhouse in Montreal, a rooftop soil-based farm in Paris, and an indoor vertical farm, one of those integrations that Michael mentioned. This one's in Kyoto. Which one of these is best? Which is the solution for urban farming? Well, the answer is it's complicated. As Michael showed, the whole system around agriculture is complicated. And to understand it, we need to really create a framework to start looking at these things. One of the things we do at Agritecture is we analyze these based on a spectrum of urban agriculture. So as architects, you have choices about how you use unused spaces in cities. So on the low-tech side, we have community gardens. We start to get a little bit more high-tech with rooftop farms. Maybe we have hybrid models where we combine hydroponics and community gardening. We have rooftop hydroponic models. And then we have the ultra high-tech indoor vertical farms. Now, my point here is really that there are trade-offs across the spectrum. There's not one size that fits all. Some of them have a higher carbon footprint in some markets where the energy is sourced from carbon, while other ones are going to have different benefits like urban heat island effect, social impact, etc. So let's go a little bit deeper. When Agritecture looks at urban agriculture, we analyze it from 6 main impact categories. So social impact, economic impact, environmental. The triple bottom line is really the foundation of this analysis. But you can also have other impacts that are important in cities like aesthetic, the impact on health and well-being, and education. But we're going to focus a little bit closer on really the environmental impacts in this analysis today. So a lot of my knowledge comes from the fact that I've been analyzing urban farming for 10 years as a blogger and also for the past 6 years as a consultant. And this is an example of some of our projects around the world. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that context really matters when you're thinking about urban agriculture. Real estate prices are different, labor prices are different. The cost of moving transportation and food is different. The access to local food is different. Talent, all these factors really matter when you're thinking about it. So you need to practice, typical design thinking that I'm sure you're all accustomed with to narrow down to the right solutions. But in order to do that, you need to understand the pros and cons of each of these methods. And that's what Agritecture does. We try to break that down. I'm going to try and help frame your thinking a little bit in the context of environmental impact. So let's dive into some case studies to kind of explore that together. So this one is Luffa Farms. Now Luffa Farms is a very exciting urban agriculture project, and they've been operating for almost 10 years now. I think 2009 was their first facility in Montreal. And they focus exclusively on rooftop hydroponic farms. They grow a multitude of produce, and they also source some other produce and kind of create CSA boxes for the community. But the majority of their produce is grown in these farms. And they're growing a wide range of products. This is kind of what the basket looks like that the consumer gets. So they're growing all kinds of tomatoes and leafy greens and peppers. And they're even working with other new crops like strawberries as well. So they've got 4 rooftop greenhouses now. This one that was just pictured is the world's largest hydroponic greenhouse in the world that was just recently opened. So they sell this through a CSA model, and that's creating about 25,000 pounds per week, I think per facility. And their newest location is about 160,000 square feet. So the estimated CapEx, I did some analysis, they didn't publicize it, but I estimate this is probably around 50 million for this facility. And rooftop farms, just so you know, are typically a little bit more expensive, or I'd say maybe 30, 40% more expensive than on the ground greenhouse. And that's because of the integration to the building, et cetera. And I definitely don't recommend ones that are smaller than 40,000 square feet for economies of scale. So this is kind of the context of the project. Let's think a little bit about the impact. So as I was looking more into this, I was looking at the impact that Luffa Farms has. And now Luffa Farms, combined with all of its farms, providing food to 2% of Montreal's population. So that's pretty impressive for about 10 years and a pretty emerging technology. And so one of the things that their CEO talks about a lot is that there's a future for them to power all of these in a renewable way. And certainly Canada has the benefit of certain renewable energy that it can access that justifies something like growing indoors, which does tend to have a higher carbon footprint depending on where you are. So the vision is really, let's convert these kinds of available lazy spaces in cities into productive farms, create jobs, and have extra benefits related to that. So the main benefits that are really connected to a Luffa Farms model are less food miles, right? There's a lot of imported product that is going to Canada and Montreal, less water use, and that comes from the hydroponic methods that Michael talked about as well, where we recycle water. Typically, you can expect about 70 to 90% of water savings with hydroponics. And another important point is less waste. As you shorten that supply chain, you have less waste. And wasted product, there's about 40% typical waste in agricultural production, tends to emit carbon as well. So not only lost resources going into that, but there's actually carbon emissions from that waste when it's not dealt with properly. Resilience is an important benefit. If there's a storm or a hurricane, these indoor systems tend to be more resilient than outdoor ones. And potential for lower carbon footprint. Again, I don't want to say it's always lower carbon footprint, but if it's powered by renewable, you could have the entire farm essentially powered by green energy. So it's kind of the vision of these rooftop greenhouses and a potential impact there. So let's go over to Paris and look at sous les fraises, which kind of means like through the berries. And what they do is they convert rooftops, all kinds of rooftops, historical buildings, very complicated rooftops, into soil-based farms. And they use sort of like these vertical systems, imagine scaffolding and sort of like a woolen material, and then a drip system with little pockets on it that the plants grow in. So it kind of creates these sort of tunnels that they grow through, that you can walk through, that create more density and production. But because they're soil-based, they can have a huge, huge variety of products. So they've got strawberries, they've got all kinds of herbs, they're even growing hops, and they have their own beer, for example. So they're creating added value products as well, not just kind of the typical leafy greens and tomatoes you would see. So they've expanded to almost 9 locations across Paris. And if you're looking for a policy case study, Paris is one to look at because their pariculture urban agriculture strategy has actually really accelerated urban agriculture to 16 hectares of urban farming space in 5 years, which I can't find a city that's done better than that. So berries, herbs, hops, all kinds of things. Now, granted, these kinds of organic soil-based methods tend to be focused on premium customers. And that is something that you can critique about urban farming. This is not necessarily feeding the entire population. It is a premium product. But I think the benefit of urban agriculture for Paris is a little bit different. It's mostly focused on the reduction of urban heat island effect, which is what I'm going to look at next. So approximately 22,000 plants on a 15,000 square foot space. So again, think about that verticality. And capital cost is much, 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 much lower than these greenhouse facilities. So that's also a big benefit when you're thinking about startups and you're thinking about real estate developers, what they're going to be considering. But one important point is this isn't year-round production. So it doesn't supply that in the winter months necessarily. So you do have that issue where in the winter months, you are going to have to shift back to importing. And that's okay. You have to kind of weigh those trade-offs. What's going to matter more in the case of your unique location for applying the farm? So this is a lot of words here, but essentially the mayor of Paris made this commitment to develop 100 hectares of urban green space to reduce the heat island effect because there were thousands of people that died in Paris and in France due to the heat wave in 2003. And so they put about $8 million kind of into this initiative, and they've achieved about 16 hectares of their 30 hectare goal for urban farming space. So again, a good policy case. So there's over 60 urban farms now that have gone through this. They have an annual competition for spaces, and they're building the world's largest rooftop farm there as well. I think it's about to open or has just opened recently. But the main point here is that when you convert rooftop spaces into urban farms, especially if they're soil-based, you're creating numerous benefits. Insulation on the building, you get that from greenhouses too. But in this case, with soil and green spaces, as you know, with green roofs, it reduces the heat island effect. And so it kind of stabilizes that temperature in the summer, because that extra 2 degrees you get, that's what's really going to hurt those elderly people. And so that's what we're really trying to avoid. And so what's exciting here is we're combining the benefits of growing food and the typical benefits of urban heat island effect reduction. And I'd say that's probably one of the main benefits of this. And another benefit is biodiversity and contributing to that, which is a little bit harder to measure for cities than urban heat island effect, but it's certainly a benefit we don't want to ignore. So let's go over to Japan and look at sort of a high-tech system. This is Spreadco, and you should look at more of their pictures online. They're one of the earliest vertical farming companies, again, out of Kyoto. And their first facility was really quite labor intensive. Labor tends to be one of the highest costs in vertical farms and agriculture in general. But their newest system is more of like a roboticized farm. They've cut labor by 50%. They've become even more efficient with water. Vertical farms tend to be in that 90% to 95% water savings relative to their conventional farming counterparts. And so, you know, the vertical farming, one thing that's really exciting about it is it's growing really exponentially because there's so much tech and so much data out of these farms. They learn very quickly and they are improving very, very rapidly. Also, there's exponential technology built into it, like the LEDs, and LEDs are essentially microchips. And so there's something called Heitz's law, where the efficiency of LEDs is actually doubling as the cost is going down. So CapEx is dropping in vertical farms and efficiency is going up. And so the first vertical farms really started to sprout globally, I would say, only a little over 10 years ago. So it's still in its nascency, and in North America, only about 6-7 years max. So we really have a long way to go still to figure this out, but the economics are improving consistently. And this is certainly the most requested form of urban agriculture that we get contacted about around the world. So, however, one of the things is they don't grow a lot of variety. So they just grow lettuce. They just focus on 4 different kinds of lettuce. That's it, and that's what they do very well. But they can produce 30,000 heads of lettuce per day. So think about those per day numbers that Michael was talking about in places like Shanghai and how much consumption is from leafy greens. Places like Singapore, places like Shanghai, vertical farms can make a meaningful impact that can protect that arable land. And I think that's really one of the main benefits that I was looking at in this, which I'm going to get into the next slide. So the estimated CapEx of this is about $20 million. You know, all those lights, all those systems tend to be very, very expensive. And so vertical farming is definitely the most expensive per square foot method of production and certainly has the most equipment. So embodied energy, these are some of the concerns you're going to look at from a sustainability perspective. So one of the impacts that's interesting for me with Spread is the kind of history of forests and forest protection in Japan. So Japan is obviously an island and has limited space and high population. And so forests have been degraded significantly, as you can see in the chart below. And so how do we protect forests when we have rising populations around the world? Well, we need to really make sure that the arable land that we have available is used for the crops that can't be grown in other methods like hydroponically indoors. Now, Japan incentivized vertical farming very early on to respond to this. And they also did it for various reasons, including, you know, need for clean product in the face of some nuclear issues with the soil and things like that. But bottom line, it's really about saving that arable land. It's about saying, okay, well, if we're going to dedicate space to agriculture, let's make sure we're using it for the things that can only be grown in those areas. This also localizes the food system overall and reduces the need for imports, because if you don't have arable land, you either have to import or cut down forests. So I think that's one of the main benefits in this system, and certainly with their technology, they're saving a lot of water. Japan isn't a particularly water scarce country, but again, you can imagine this case in another country that has forest issues and water issues, and that starts to become an even more compelling case. So when it comes to vertical farming, especially as an expensive form of urban agriculture, you're looking for as many of those drivers as possible: food safety issues, water issues, lack of arable land, to justify the CapEx and the potential impacts of this facility. So is it really worth the effort? Let's dive a little bit into that. Well, again, globally, there's an analysis that was done. There's an $80 billion opportunity for unused spaces in cities, rooftops, warehouse spaces, vacant spaces for urban agriculture. It's about 10% of the vegetable and fruit supply globally. So it's a pretty big opportunity. Michael reminded us that demand is coming from cities. So cities need to be at the table in planning these food systems. And I think that driver will only continue. Another thing I want to mention is that urban agriculture is really the main sustainable urban technology that embraces the food, waste, water, energy nexus. There are other technologies that tackle part of that, but I think by embracing urban agriculture, we will unlock more ways to understand sustainability in our cities, because urban farms have to balance all of this nexus together all the time. So can it be a low carbon food source? Now this chart is a little bit complicated in some ways, but bottom line, a large beverage company hired Agritecture to look at a global analysis, or an analysis of comparing conventional farms in California to a vertical farm on the outskirts of New York and a greenhouse on the outskirts of New York. And all of these are kind of at scale farms. So it's a very large traditional farm. It's quite a large scale vertical farm and quite a large greenhouse. You can email me if you want some of the background info around this. So across the board, we found that vertical farms had the highest carbon footprint in this scenario. But the transportation from the farms in California was notable. Although it's only a small percentage of that total carbon footprint, it was notable. And greenhouses tend to be some of the most competitive on the carbon footprint side. Now, I will say that we aren't accounting for lighting in these greenhouses. So you can have a greenhouse in New York that grows product through the winter without lighting, but it does slow down. So if you added lighting to this, it does account for heating, but it doesn't account for lighting. So if you added lighting to this, it would actually increase that carbon footprint. So this is the kind of analysis that we need to do to understand what kind of farms we should implement and for which crops, to really start to strategize integration of urban agriculture properly for carbon reduction analysis. These are some other kind of modeling considerations you would look at. Again, insulation of the greenhouse or the soil-based farm, stormwater management, biodiversity of either the rooftop soil one or the on-the-ground one, urban heat island effect for all of those. Basement farms can be use of unused spaces. Organic waste management, meaning composting and circular economy related to these farms is a consideration, something you can calculate. Water reduction, something you can calculate. Food mile reduction. So we have to look at all of these things when making these decisions and think about it. And this is how complex the analysis is in something like agriculture. So what will it take to scale this up, to scale up urban ag? Well, we need to further improve LEDs and HVAC. We need to do a thorough life cycle analysis. Our analysis was just carbon footprint. We need to look at the whole system and all the equipment. We need more operational talent because there's a bit of a gap in the talent to work in these farms. And we need to mature zoning. Cities need to recognize agriculture as a use. Okay, I'm going to speed up a little bit. So this is the bottom line. Until architects, planners, developers can access reliable models for urban agriculture in their cities and source the operators, it will remain a sideshow. It won't get to that 100% of the population provided with some food from these farms. So we have quite a ways to go, but we are improving, and there's a renaissance and a lot of interest globally going into this. If you want to estimate the cost for a greenhouse or a vertical farm, we have a software that you can do that. It's design.agritecture.com. This is kind of what it looks like. You can input some data about your site. We'll tell you how many people it could feed. Typical CapEx will tell you water use, energy use. It's a great way to kind of estimate what's possible here. And it covers, again, vertical farms and greenhouses, and you can even think about them on the rooftop as well. So it's kind of a little snapshot of what it looks like on the inside. Just wanted to show this to you because we've built this in part to really empower architects to do the most low-cost, quick analyses for properties that they have when thinking about these high-tech forms of agriculture. And so you can kind of look at the jobs created, et cetera. So whether it's for your client or for one of your studies, Agritecture Designer is a useful tool for you there. So let's dive into some questions. I know I went a little bit over, but I guess I'll start with one of the questions I got first, if that's okay, Michael, which was in relation to the health of these products. The question was about if you're growing food on the rooftop and there's pollution and environmental pollutants in the city, is that food healthy? All I can say is that Brooklyn Grange actually did a really good study comparing an organic farm upstate to their product. And their farm is on the 8th story next to a highway in Brooklyn, or one of their farms. And they saw no meaningful increase in the toxins in the plants that were going to the customers. And they're quite honest, authentic people. So I really stand by that research that they did. So it tends, but certainly the soil itself, if you were to just get regular soil in New York City, you should not grow in it. It's completely toxic. So all of the soil on their rooftop had to be brought in, and that has its own environmental questions related to it.
Thank you, Henry. Maybe we can include that link to that research or information on it in the written questions that we post later on the website. So I'll follow up with you about that.
Okay.
We've got about 5 minutes left for more questions. One that came into the Q&A box was, aside from leafy greens, what crops are more suitable for vertical farms in cities?
Yeah, unfortunately, economically, leafy greens, microgreens are really the main crops right now. And that's because they have a fast turnaround. They have a high edible biomass, a high percentage of the product that's edible. So if you're replacing sunlight with LED lights, you want to make sure the maximum biomass is being produced. If I grow an avocado tree under LED light, it's a lot of time, a lot of energy to just get one avocado. While lettuce, it's significant. And so those are the kinds of things that are very important. But technically, everything has been grown in vertical farms. There's been wheat, corn, et cetera, and there's ongoing research to improve them. The next crops you can expect in these farms that are going to be commercialized are strawberries and specialty kind of cherry tomatoes and maybe specialty peppers.
I think the other thing to add here too is just around the nutritional content of those leafy greens and other food as well. When most vegetables are picked, but especially leafy greens, they're losing about 30% of their nutritional value within 24 hours of being harvested, and up to 70%, 70 to 80% after they've been transported for a week to 10 days, which is kind of the typical life cycle of going from farm to table in most of the United States after it's gone through your grocery store and to your home. So the closer they are to these cities, again, especially these leafy greens, to the people who are eating them, the higher the nutritional content as well.
Absolutely. I think that's an important point. And also the connection is better. Like, you value the product in a different way when you understand where it came from. And that's important for our population in cities to understand that and respect the food.
Thank you. Someone asks, can you confirm that your study showed that a conventional outdoor farm has a larger carbon footprint than a greenhouse? And did this also compare conventional versus organic farms?
So we looked at a non-organic conventional farm in California at scale, and we compared it to an at-scale greenhouse on the outskirts of New York. And yes, without lighting considered, all of those crops considered, the greenhouse had the lowest carbon footprint. Again, this is not a full life cycle analysis, so it could go many different ways. Cornell is actually pursuing the first life cycle analysis of these comparisons, and we're all very excited about it. But for example, what does it take to build the roads to get to those farms that are at scale and spread out, or the wells, or the irrigation? That kind of analysis is also important on both sides, or the embodied energy in the equipment structures that are in the greenhouse. We have a lot more work to do before we can say urban farms are always sustainable or always low carbon. That's not the claim I'm making. I'm saying from a carbon perspective for sourcing, that's the data so far. That's the data that we found in that analysis.
Yeah, it's important to step back and think about this holistically. It's not an apples to apples comparison. When you think about a traditional soil-based farm, there are a whole host of other factors, including the labor necessary to man those farms, the disruption of soil every year or seasonally, which releases carbon, a higher and better use environmentally and ecologically for that land. So just looking at the two, as Henry's study has done, is a bit oversimplified when you take into all of those other considerations that goes into kind of traditional farming and the land consumption required.
Yeah, very much so. Pesticide use, fertilizer use as well is very different. From the farms I showed you, the examples, none of them use pesticides and none of them are putting fertilizers into the water stream. So those are also very important impacts for the overall sustainability impact. So you have to really do the work and do the individual analysis for specific farms. And when we go in depth for certain clients for designing a certain farm and sustainability is important to them, especially, we really do look at those things. But for Coca-Cola, they were just looking at one single analysis.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one more question. We have 2 minutes to the end of the session. Someone asks, do you envision all food could be grown within urban areas, or will there always be some types of food that can only be grown in rural areas and farms? And just a reminder that any questions we don't get to, we'll try to answer in writing and share on the website.
I can start, Henry, you can follow up. I mean, I think it depends on the type of food that we're eating. It's super important to think about eating locally sourced food as much as you possibly can. Obviously, depending on where you live in the world, there are going to be some crops, whether it's bananas if you don't live in a tropical location, or almonds if you don't live where they can grow, that need to be grown in other parts of the world and moved around through transportation. But if we can reduce the amount of food that we need to import from elsewhere, that's just going to benefit all of us. So it's really about looking at our current excesses when it comes to food, shifting our expectations and diets accordingly, but also thinking about managing these systems very differently as well, so that we can still enjoy these wonderful crops from around the world, but also try to eat more locally.
Yeah, I agree with all the points that Michael said. I think one case study to look at that's really interesting is Melbourne, that has about 40% sourcing of local food for its population. So again, a lot of drivers are how big is the city, what's the climate, and how protected is the agricultural land around the city. We are expanding our cities rapidly and rolling over agriculture that supplies local food. And in some ways, that at scale local food is better than urban farms. The only reason we need urban farms in some ways is because we've rolled over it with pavement, right? So if we protect those critical areas around the city that produce agriculture, we actually can achieve significant percentages of local food supply to the city. But we have to integrate into planning in a very meaningful way.
Thank you so much. Thank you, both of you, Michael and Henry. We will conclude the session now, and you can visit the agenda at carbon-positive.org to find your next session.
Thank you.
Thank
and
you.
Keep an eye out also for the published questions in the coming weeks. If you're not subscribed to Architecture 2030's mailing list, you can go to architecture2030.org/enews and subscribe to make sure that you get the updates when the recordings are available and when the questions are answered. Thank you so much.